Oh, first of all, I want to thank everybody for being here at 8 o'clock. This is really harsh. I was expecting about a third of this turnout, so thank you all for being here. I really appreciate it. So we're here to talk today about Drupal caching. My name is Bill Bohling. I'm a software developer at Turner, now known as Warner Media. I've been doing Drupal since about Drupal 5, though I didn't really get any kind of serious about it until a few years ago, joining Turner. They decided back in 2015 that they were going to put all of their brand sites on Drupal 8. So I'm on a group called the Draco team. Our job is to write modules that the brand sites can use. So I've been doing that for about the past 4 years. But there's still plenty. There's a lot of development going on the brand sides too. Anyway, excuse the disorganization. It is early. So start off with this quote: "There are only two hard things in computer science: cache invalidation and naming things." Cache invalidation. What are some problems that any of you guys can think of with cache invalidation? Anyone? Anyone? What's it? Okay, authenticated users. Multiple layers of caching. Yep, there's all of that going on. So basically, the reason that we do caching is that we want to make our server do as little work as possible. So that includes hitting the database, processing data, even returning HTML, anything that we can do to reduce the load on the server is going to help us out. The problem with modern web pages, like Amy mentioned, is that you've got a lot of different elements all over the page. You've got like a masthead that could stay the same for a year, until your site gets redesigned. You can have a user block that's going to be different for every user. If you've got a news site, like we happen to have a few of, you might have a headline block that could be good for a couple hours, but it could change at any minute. And you need to be able to update all of these things, appropriately. Up to Drupal 7, all we had, getting my, let's see, sorry about that. I'm having trouble with my navigation here. So anyway, you've got all these different things going. You want to be able to invalidate your cache to keep your content fresh, but you don't want to invalidate too often, or why bother having any caching? So that's basically the hard part of cache invalidation with Drupal. Up until 7, Drupal just had what we called page caching, and what that did was cache whole pages for anonymous users. And that worked fine if your site is all anonymous users. The only way to clear that, though, even with that, you had to go into your performance and actually manually clear the cache, or you had to call drush CR somewhere or other to clear the cache, and that was it. Drupal 8, well, that's what we're here to look at today. So, as far as an agenda, let's see, we will start off. I'm going to talk briefly about the whole cache stack, because there's caching going on outside of Drupal too. So we'll go through that. The basics of caching in Drupal, the pieces that are involved with caching, how cache gets invalidated, the headers that you get when you are invalidating cache so you can see what happened. We'll talk about some caching gotchas, some things that can mess you up when you're trying to cache or not cache, and then some tips, tricks, and workarounds to help you get around some of these gotchas. And there are donuts, so please feel free at any time to grab a donut, and if you need to wander around and see what's there, it's not going to bother me. Okay, so at the basic level, the lowest level we're going to go anyway, is MySQL and PHP. So what PHP will do, it's got what they call opcode caching. And that will cache little bits of compiled PHP code so you don't have to keep reinterpreting it with every request. MySQL caches queries, and it just caches queries like exact wording of the query. Fortunately, we don't have to worry about, Drupal will do pretty well with that because we're making most of our calls using entity managers and stuff like that. So the queries that we are sending to the database for the most part will be exactly the same, and MySQL can help out a little bit with that. On top of those, we have Redis and Memcache. These are a couple of in-memory key value stores that can speed things up a lot for you because you can hit the memory instead of the database, and we'll talk about that a little more later. And now comes Drupal, and we will be talking a lot more about that in a little bit, but this is where it fits. Above Drupal, and then we're off the server now, is onto Varnish. Varnish is a reverse proxy that sits between your server and the internet. It basically just stores static content. So like GET and head requests, it can store those. Also, it can help you with some security and handle some of the SSL stuff. But we're here to talk about caching. So let's move along with that. Then the last level is content delivery networks, or CDNs. These are things like Akamai, Fastly, Cloudflare. My tongue does work this morning. These speed things up because they're interconnected servers that can be scattered geographically. So one of the big benefits you get from these is that your server is closer to the user, which can speed things up. And these things cache not just content, but they'll cache JavaScript, CSS files, any media that you've got. This can all be out on these CDNs, aka edge caching. So, Drupal caching basics. At the very bottom on Drupal caching basics, we have two modules that handle caching. There's the internal page cache, and this one basically does the same thing as Drupal caching did up until Drupal 7. It works for anonymous users and just stores entire pages. The dynamic page cache helps with anonymous and authenticated users. And what this will do is, let's see, let me make sure I got my notes right here. Yeah, this will cache pages minus personalized parts like user navigation blocks, et cetera, et cetera. Now, both of these, an important thing to remember about both of these is these are going to cache things forever. On their own, they're going to cache things forever. The internal page cache has some configuration that you can set a time limit on in your UI, but that really just applies for proxies and other things. It doesn't clear the cache out on your Drupal site, so keep that in mind. And also, if you've got a really big site, you can probably safely turn off internal page caching. And also, if you have an anonymous site or a site that you're serving personalized content to anonymous users, you would want to turn off internal page caching too. This would include, like if you have a shopping cart or something like that where somebody doesn't have to log in, but their shopping cart is going to belong to them, you would want to turn off internal page caching. Now the way Drupal handles caching, and something I want to get into here now is we're talking about caching used to be expired. You would have a cache and it would be good for a certain amount of time, and then it would expire. In Drupal 8, we now have invalidation instead of expiration, and that's a really big thing. So the way Drupal handles that is with cacheability metadata. I have to say that slow because I tend to trip over it a lot. So cacheability metadata consists of three things. First of all, there are cache tags. And what these do is define data dependencies for an item. This could be, usually it'll be a render array. So it'll say you've got a render array that outputs a block of content and depends on a node. You can put a cache tag in there that says, when this node changes, I want to invalidate this cache and get the fresh content. Drupal recognizes a lot of tags on its own, just because of the way entities are set up, but you can use your own also, but as long as you remember to invalidate them yourself. A really cool thing about cache tags is you can also use these to invalidate caches up or downstream. So on Varnish and on your CDN, you can pass your cache tags and validation tags to them and refresh your content out at the edge. So learn about cache tags, love them, and use them. Let's see. Next up is context. These depend on variations in things like language, user role, theme, URL, basically like configuration sort of things. You can invalidate based on a context. And then finally is max age. It's still around even though we don't use it very much. This just says how long an item is going to be valid before it needs to be reloaded. You can put an actual, I think it goes in seconds. You can use a value of 0. Most of the time in Drupal now, because of invalidation, we'll be just setting this to permanent, and we'll look at that a little bit later on also. So at this point, we get this slightly jarring slide to remind you of a very important safety tip, that cacheability metadata bubbles up. This is really important to remember. You can get yourself into and out of a lot of trouble because of that. This one didn't come out very well. I'm stepping away here. So what bubbling up means is that a parent will take on the cacheability metadata of its children. So over on the sidebar here, see, we've got a sidebar that it's just identified, and its tag is just sidebar. Inside of that, it's got 3 nodes. Each one of those has a render array, and it has a cache tag that says, one says node 2, node 3, and node 5. So the cacheability metadata that sidebar knows about is sidebar, node 1, or node 2, node 3, node 5. Likewise, masthead and user, when we get up to the very top of the page level, it knows about all of these things inside of there. So what this means, and I'll probably get to this again to repeat myself, but if you invalidate any of these tags, that's going to, the top, your page level will know about that tag has been invalidated, so it'll know that it needs to reload your page. So, and then if a component doesn't specify any cacheability metadata, it'll get the cacheability of its parents. So in the main section here, none of these have cache tags, so they will only get refreshed if main gets refreshed. And this is a thing that you can probably get hung up a lot. If you've got a block like this and you're not invalidating inside of that, and you're going, wait a minute, I changed this content, why aren't I seeing it? Check first of all to make sure that you've got a cache tag on it. If you don't, add one, and make sure that that cache tag is being invalidated.
So,
oh yeah, questions?
Node 5.
No.
Node 5, we invalidate that cache tag. Is this the child of sidebar, which is a
a child of the page.
So that gets invalidated. That's a trigger the entire page gets reloaded.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. Well, it's kind of sort of like that. Drupal will still try to use anything cached in here that it can, but anything that's been invalidated, it's going to know to reload. The dynamic page caching is kind of smart like that.
So it'll reload the page, but it'll also look at the cache viability of everything it knows about.
Mm-hmm. And also, and something else with this, it just bubbles up these things. The way it works is when Drupal's building the page, it gathers all these cache tags and it just merges them into an array that ends up at the very top. Something you don't have to worry about, like what if I'm invalidating on node 5 and then also on the masthead? There really isn't any kind of collision sort of thing going on. If anything gets invalidated, it's going to reload whatever it needs to reload because of the invalidation. So, okay. Excuse me. Drupal stores its cache data in a couple of tables. There's the cache bin tables, which are cache underscore whatever. These can be things like page, taxonomies, navigation. I can't remember what they are, but if you look at your database, you can see what they all are. You can make up your own cache bins. If you've got a module that's doing a lot of caching on its own, you can make up your own cache bin to speed up the lookups on that. And then there's also a cache tags table, which we'll look at in a little bit, because these two things are actually how Drupal decides whether or not something needs to be refreshed. So make sure I'm getting all of my stuff here. Okay, moving along, Drupal provides 2 types of caching. There's render caching, and this is what you use for anything that's going to be rendered on a page. You handle this inside of render arrays. And then there's also response caching. So if you're returning a feed or some kind of an object, you can put a you can put a dependency on your response that you're sending back, and Drupal will know you can tell it what this thing needs to be refreshed on. So you can always get a fresh response.
Can you go back?
Oh, sure.
The 2-part. Okay, render caching report is like render to HTML.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, JSON API does this. So if you're returning a response, if you're returning an object, you can, in your response, you can say to add a cacheable dependency. I'll look at it, we'll show an example of that. But you can say that this response depends on this object. And when that object changes, then your response cache will get refreshed. So, good? Okay, so a little more about render caching. So we've got render, or let's see. Oh boy, the brain goes away. Render arrays, that's it. So this is a really simple render array. It's just going to say, take this, I've gotten this content for Node somewhere, run it through my template, and output that HTML into the page. So as is, this one won't cache anything at all because we haven't told it to. So this won't get refreshed until one of its parents gets refreshed. So what we want to do for that is add cacheability metadata to it. So that's just as simple as adding this cache attribute. Going down here, the keys at the top there, this is not required. But what this will do is if you provide a key for a render array, it will write an item into the cache bin for that render array. So for this one here, we say keys, entity view, node ID. In the cache bin, it'll be identified by the CID entity view : node : and then a node ID. So if you manually need to call this out of the cache bin, you can access it using that cache ID. Then context, this one will change if somebody changes languages. Tags, almost all Drupal entities have this get cache tags as part of the built-in thing. So it's a good idea to call that if you're doing your own entity and extend the right interfaces, you should get this. But that's why, like as we saw in the diagram, this is how Drupal knows that if node 5 changes to refresh the cache, because node 5 knows that one of its cache tags is node : 5. So that's how that works. And then we've also got cache permanent for max age. What that does is guarantees that the only thing that's going to invalidate this thing is going to be a tag. So if you're using tags and stuff, you always want to use cache permanent.
So when you say the only thing that will invalidate is a tag?
Huh? Well, if you invalidate the tag, so age won't get in your way, is right. I guess what I mean by that.
So what will invalidate this? Obviously,
if you update the node, it'll invalidate that. If you get a user using a different language, we'll invalidate it. But those are the only two things. Yeah, you don't want max age because you don't want to invalidate too often.
But could you have a field on this node that has cache tags?
Drupal caches everything, so even in field definitions, etc. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm not real sure down to that level, but I mean, if you go into your node and you change the value of one of your fields when you hit save, what Drupal does is it invalidates when you update anything behind the scenes. Drupal calls an invalidator. So.
Well, I was thinking if you click at it or something, you're not actually editing the entire node, you're just editing a field.
Mm-hmm.
I don't have any use cases where, any realistic use cases. I'm just curious if, for nodes, if there's if there could be a child of the node that would trigger the invalidation of the entire node.
Oh, let's see. Well, if it's yeah, oh yeah, that's a good one. but I'm only here so you guys will know what to Google later. So I'm not here to make anybody an expert on caching. But there are definitely some behaviors that I'm not covering here. I've run into some things just recently where I'm trying to change a field definition in an entity, and you've got to clear the field definition cache and all of that. And I discovered that way too late to try to work it into this presentation. So.
Can I ask another question?
Sure.
So you said, if you don't have that hash cache key in the render array,
Mm-hmm.
it's going to be not cached every time.
It won't be cached. Yeah. The only. Oh, go ahead.
Which of the subkeys is it max age
Until something else happens, yeah.
So it's a max age one now. But
Yeah. Yeah, you just want to make sure that your max age doesn't try to invalidate your cache. I'll go into it a little bit later of how the tags actually are used to invalidate a cache. But have a donut. Let's see. Yeah, just got to make sure. Yeah, and like you said, if you don't have that cache attribute in there, this block won't get invalidated until one of its parents gets invalidated. So that might be an item or a block that it's contained inside of. It might be all the way up to the page level. So you don't want to rely on parents to invalidate your caches for you as a takeaway here. So for response caching, like if you're, like I said, doing a feed, API call or something like that, you'll get response caching, and this is provided by the cacheable dependency interface and refinable cacheable dependency interface. Now the difference between those two is cacheability dependency interface just says that this item is a cacheable dependency. And so that's good for stuff that doesn't change very often. The refinable cacheable dependency interface is more configurable, so you can specify, it has methods to specify, set a tag and set context on things. So if you're defining, let's see, let me make sure I got my notes here. Okay, so all entities in Drupal implement both of these interfaces. And then they also extend the entity abstract class. And then I have my notes in here. Even field storage definitions are cacheable, it says in the notes. So any entities, if you're defining any custom entities, you should implement the entity interface and extend the entity abstract class. And then you will get these implementations of these interfaces. You might need to do something special in your entity for the get cache tags method to define in your entity what can invalidate that entity. Okay. So the way you set this up, say I've got this thing that I'm going to return this response. I'm getting this object from somewhere. It could be a node. It could be an entity. It could be something. So you have a response that you say this response deals with this object. And then the cacheable dependency is on this object. And what that'll do is that says when this object changes, then I can refresh the cache on this object and return a fresh response with the new updated data. Now here we see if you're using the refinable, then you can call these add cache tags and add cache context on that object also, and then or on that response, and then return that. For Dave, there's also caching on access. I haven't gotten to look into this a whole lot, but you can cache on anything that returns an access result interface. You can add cacheable dependencies like that. Okay, so cache invalidation. So far we've got cacheability metadata, we've got Drupal, we've got modules that are going to cache our content forever until we tell it otherwise, and this is how that's going to happen. Most of the time you don't have to worry about this because entity calls this invalidate tags on save anytime you're saving an update. So when you update an entity, it invalidates the tags for that entity. The next time that entity gets loaded, it knows that its cache has been invalidated and you'll get the fresh content. But if you're using any custom tags, you need to invalidate these on your own. And for this, Drupal provides the cache tags invalidator service. So you inject that, or if you can't inject it, just use the cache class and then call this invalidate tags on it. Pass it an array of whatever tags you want to invalidate. And Drupal will take care of the rest, and here's how. Whenever you invalidate a tag, Drupal has the cache tags table that we mentioned earlier. It has a list of all of the tags that your site knows about. And then over in the invalidations column, it keeps a count. Every time you invalidate a tag, it's going to increment that count in the cache tags table. Along with that, we've got the cache bin tables. I mentioned there are several different different varieties of cache bin tables. They all have this same structure. There's the CID, and then the two important parts here are the tags and the checksum. So you've got an item in the cache, it knows what tags it's going to use, and it's got this checksum. So when you request this object, Drupal's going to look at that cache tags, at the tags column. It's going to find all the tags that are in there. It's going to find all those tags in the cache tags table, get those invalidation counts and total those up, and write those to the checksum column in your cache bin table. So when you invalidate an item, it increments the number in the cache tags table. When Drupal comes in and looks at this, it's going to add up all those invalidations again and get that number. It's going to compare them to the checksum in the cache bin table. They're going to be different because the invalidation counts have changed. So Drupal knows to invalidate that item. And there, like I said, the cache bins goes all the way up. There's like a dynamic page cache bin and a page cache bin. So this is how, and this is why the bubbling up becomes really important also. This basically, what all this does is if you invalidate a cache anywhere on your page, you can invalidate the entire page. Question? Okay, let's see. And so then every time, so again, every time you change anything, it's going to change, or anytime you invalidate that a tag, all that stuff will get updated. And then we'll store also, when it invalidates a cache, it stores the new total from your cache tags in that checksum. So it always has the latest stuff on there. Okay, so to see what's going on with caching, if you're running into problems, if you're not seeing something invalidated that you think should be invalidated, or something is being invalidated that you don't think should be invalidated, you want to check these tables, the xDrupal cache tags and xDrupal cache context tables. These you turn these on by setting these debug cacheability headers to true in your services YAML file. If you're not using that, Drupal inside of sites default has a default services YAML. You just tell your settings PHP to use that default services, and then you can edit default services. You're going to might need to do that for a couple other things we'll look at also. But once you set these cacheability headers to true, then you can go in on your console and check what's going on and check Drupal cache tags, and this will show you all the tags that have been used to invalidate that current page. So these, I mentioned earlier that the tags are really handy because you can use them to invalidate caches out on your edge. So I'm just going to briefly go through the ones. I'm not going to go into any specifics on Akamai or Fastly or any of these because I don't know what you're using. I don't care. Look it up, see what it is that your edge uses. But these will help. So for Akamai, you use the edge cache tag. This consists of a comma-separated list of tag values. And helpfully, Drupal provides an Akamai contrib module, which Akamai strongly suggests that you use. And so who am I to argue with them? I will recommend that you use that also. For Fastly, uses one called surrogate key. This is a space-separated list of tags, so your tag names shouldn't contain spaces. That's something you're going to want to pay attention to if you're using an edge. Make sure that you're using the right format for the tags that you're passing along to it. If it can't, I would say in general, don't put spaces in, just because, just don't. And then lastly is the cache tag header. This one is used by Cloudflare. This is also a comma-separated list like Akamai. And then on Varnish, if you're using Varnish, they use the X cache tags header. And again, the specifics on actually how you use these, how you purge caches up on your downstream is going to be something depending on what you're using. So you know where to Google that. And now we go to gotchas. So what does cacheability metadata do? Anyone, everyone, 1, 2, 3. Very good. This isn't really a gotcha unless you forget about it. So again, it bubbles up. So just remember that, and you should be fine. One that really is a problem is early rendering. So while you're building your page, you've got these render arrays. At any time while you're putting your page together, you can call Drupal render and actually render your render array. The reason you don't want to do that is as soon as you do that, the only thing that's going to pass up is the content from that render array. You lose all your cacheability metadata. So if you've got something that's going to be changing a lot and you render it early, it's not going to get updated until one of its parents does, which on a news site you can see where this could be really problematic if you've got a headline that's rendering early and your page doesn't invalidate its cache for half an hour, your news site is half an hour behind the rest of the world. So don't render early. Let's see. Another one that's kind of big is these _list cache tags. These are used by views and lists. So say you've got 4 or 5 views. Say you've got 4 or 5 different content types on your site. You've set up like 5 different views to just list the items of that content type. They're all going to get the node list cache tag. And what that means is when you invalidate that node list cache tag, it's going to invalidate all of your view caches, whether you want them to or not, even if they don't contain that node. So that's, it's not that big a deal, but again, we don't want to make Drupal do any more work than it has to. So if it can only invalidate one view instead of 5, that's kind of a good thing. So, okay, now things we can do about these things. As mentioned, Drupal by default is going to write all this stuff into the database. That can improve stuff if you're just looking in a cache bin and can get the content of a node out of a cache bin. That's going to be a heck of a lot faster than calling an entity type manager, loading up the node. It's going to have to go to hit all of the node fields and return the thing. So database is a little faster. But one of the things with caching is that we want to get off the database entirely if we can help it. So for that, there's the memcache and Redis modules. What these do is give you all the stuff that Drupal has for caching, but instead of writing it to the database, it's going to write them to the memcache or Redis, so it'll be available in memory. I'm not going to go into which one of these you should use. Memcache has been around for a while. Redis is newer, has more capabilities, so if you want fancier memory caching, look into Redis. But if you're considering things, I would say look at both of these and figure out which one is going to be best for you. You still have to hit the database a little bit, like for calculating the checksums and all of that, but it's still a lot faster because your actual cache data is in memory. For views and lists, there's the custom cache tag module. What this does is adds, when you're building a view, you have the advanced settings over on the right. What this does will add a form in there where you can set your own custom cache tags for your view. So I'm using my microphone. Excuse me, folks. Got to make sure that the people watching at home can hear. Okay. So say you've got, you've got your 5 different content types, you've got 5 different views. What this will let you do is, usually when you're building views, one of the things that's going to be involved in that is filters. You're going to have some kind of filters on your view. So with this module, you can create cache tags that are based on your filters. So it offers a lot better control over invalidating your views caches. And it also lets you set cache tags passed in arguments. I have not tried that, so I don't know how it works. But again, the Googles probably do. So, okay, another timeout here to talk about Big Pipe. Big Pipe is something that was developed by Facebook. It's been stable in core since Drupal 8.3. And what this does is allows for lazy loading of your page. So what BigPipe will do, it sends HTML to the browser and then has placeholders for things that you don't want to send right away. So you can load your page while you have some other expensive stuff going on in the background, and it will load the other things as they become available. So this Particular example, we've got a personalized block, so that's going to vary by user. I've got a stock site here, and I've got a stock ticker. I want my users on here, whenever they hit my site, I want them to get the very latest Dow Jones Industrial Average, not the one from a minute ago or whatever. So behind the scenes, I've got an API that's going to go out and get the current number and plug it in there, but that could take a while. So I'm going to have a placeholder for my stock ticker also. Note that this doesn't really it doesn't really cut down on the amount of time it takes to load the entire page, because you still have to wait for those other things, but it looks a lot faster to the users. Okay, with that out of the way, some things just aren't very cacheable. So as an example, here's the render array for that personalized block that we saw earlier. It's going to say hello, whoever the name is. And we're even doing the right thing here and adding a cache tag so it can be invalidated. But even with that, I mean, how often is the same user going to be hitting the page that you're going to need to invalidate that, or be able to pull cache data for them? So that's not going to be very cacheable. To get around that, there's a thing called auto placeholdering. So what this lets you do, back up here. So in this one, we have the render array actually includes the markup that we want to return and the cache tags. For auto placeholdering, the render array just says, create a placeholder, and then it specifies a lazy builder, which this specifies a callback that's actually going to return the markup that goes into there. So Big Pipe, Drupal knows when it sees this, it just creates a placeholder and waits for that callback to return its data. When the callback returns its data, JavaScript will plug that into the page. So this is something you want to consider anytime, obviously for users, but anytime you've got something that's going to refresh often, or if you've got something really that's pretty expensive to hit and you don't want to hold up a page load while all that's going on in the background, go ahead and use the auto placeholders. So, oops. Okay, a big one. So got this out of talking to the folks on NCAA. They ran into a lot of problems with their caching. But a big thing you can do to help yourself out with that is to plan out your strategy in advance. So when you're developing a new feature, ask yourself these questions. Am I doing something expensive that's worth caching? If it's in a render array, give it a cache key. That will store it in a cache bin so you can easily look it up later. If it's an object, make it a cacheable dependency. Excuse me. Does this thing vary by permissions, URL, language, etc.? If it does, then set the appropriate cache contexts. What could cause this thing to be outdated? Like, does a node change? Does an entity change? Are you adding some items to a feed, etc.? If that's going on, add cache tags. And then, when do I need to refresh the content? A good rule of thumb here is if you're in doubt, invalidate the tags yourself. All invalidating a tag is going to do is increment a number in a cache tags table. It's not going to hurt anything. So, you can invalidate the same thing 4 times before it actually gets served, and it's not going to really hurt you anything. Lastly, I like to leave people with stuff that's actually useful. So has anyone ever seen this? Okay, yeah, me too. This is a screenshot off of my computer. So this, you've got to deal with this anytime you're working on modules, annotations, there's all kinds of things, services. And you end up needing to do this. And so a lot of times, I don't know how many times I've done this where I forget to do this and I put in a bunch of work on doing something and I go to look at my change and it's like it didn't work. Why is that? And it's because I forgot to clear the cache. So to get around that, I said we would get to the services file. So in the development services YAML provides this service called cache backend null. So enable your development services so you're using that. Step 2, in this note up at the top, if you want the really gory details, it's all in that node up there. But it's basically a matter of telling your settings local to use your development services, and then you turn off caching by assigning the cache bin to that null backend. So we turn off render caching and dynamic page caching by telling them to use the cache backend null. If you're in Drupal 8.4 or higher, you'll also need to turn off page caching specifically, and you do that by setting the bins, the page cache bin to null also. If you're doing a lot of theming, you can turn off twig caching. This is also in that same development services. It has a twig config. And that's set to true by default. Turn that off, and you should be able to do twig development and not have to refresh your cache every time you change something in your template. Lastly, be sure you test with caching on, because you've turned this off so you don't have to run drush CR. You don't want to be doing that and think, okay, everything's really cool, I can just ship this off. So you send it off and there's problems with caching, and you don't know about those because you didn't cache with testing on. So make sure before you file that PR or pass the code on to somebody else that you try it out yourself with all those, take off that cache backend null. So we've looked at the types of caching. We've looked at cacheability metadata, how Drupal invalidates. We've looked at some pitfalls and some ways to get around them. The main takeaway here is that Drupal is also already doing a lot of this for you, so you don't really have to worry about it. But if you're doing any custom entities or objects, make sure just that you're specifying the appropriate cacheability metadata. Anything that you might want to invalidate on, add that metadata and go through the things, and you should be good. So, questions? Additional questions?
When you back earlier, when you first said these things cache things forever,
Mm-hmm.
do they survive? Do cache?
No. No, what it means is that they will cache things forever until told otherwise. So if you do a drush CR, you've got, drush CR will clear that, or drush CC, and you pick whichever specific one that you want. Otherwise, Drupal will cache things until you tell it otherwise. And there's also Drupal. There's a whole bunch of cache classes. So if you don't want to use the Drupal cache backend at all, you could turn off dynamic page cache, develop all your own. I'm not going to tell you how to do that because I wouldn't bother. Anything else? Yeah.
You encountered any issues when working in the presentation or theme layer, not rendering a whole content render array, or just rendering specific parts of the render array and not having cache tags blah blah?
Well, if that's the thing, if you render, you want your tags, whatever item you render, whatever render array you render, if it has metadata in it, you will lose that. So there won't be anything bubbling up. All you're returning once you've rendered something is the rendered content. So you lose the metadata. That's why you don't ever want to render anything early. Drupal 8 did that a lot early on in the earlier versions of Drupal 8. There was a lot of early rendering. There still are some things, like I know if you get a URL, that's actually going to render early. We ran into a problem in one of our modules where we were getting this ugly error message saying that it's detecting some cacheability metadata and don't render early, and it turned out it wasn't in our code, but it was because the code somewhere along the line was getting a Drupal URL, and Drupal was rendering that URL, and so it didn't get the metadata. So, sure. Any others? Yeah. Let's basically not to render early.
So, if you wanted, I've seen that too, where you call URL method.
Mm-hmm.
So, do you just pass it as a regular array?
Actually, I can sort of answer that. I'll get to it, but I'll get to that. So yeah, Matt, who was working with us from Lullabot, he's the one that actually ran into that, and he wrote a really good article, about early rendering, and actually that was what inspired this talk was, the difficulty with that, and then I thought, oh, it'd be cool to talk about the problems people can run into with caching, and So any others? I would recommend reading that, and I will get to that in a minute. That's a really good point. So, okay, well, at the end, I would like to thank you all for being here. This is a ridiculously early time and stuff, and to be coherent and have this many people is really cool. I'd like to thank my cohorts on the Draco team for letting me put this together and not get any useful work done for about the last 3 weeks. If you want to contact me for corrections or anything, on DO, I'm Sunset Bill, and then I'm also on LinkedIn here. I will note, I will have these slides up on the session page for this session. I'll put those up right after we get out of here. And lastly, some resources. This is just a few of the things that I looked at. This Lullabot article here, Rendering Lesson in Debugging Drupal, that's the one that Matt wrote. That gives you some workarounds, like if you're getting something that is rendered early, we'll mention that. The Pantheon article gives you a really, really dramatic evidence of what happens when you use Redis or Memcache instead of relying on Drupal. And I highly recommend the render example controller. That gives you lots of examples of different render arrays. It doesn't have cacheability metadata in any of them, but since you're all here, you know how to do that now. And let's see, and that is it. So thank you much.